Okay, welcome to our video about the Zinoviev Letter. The Zinoviev Letter is an example of Western disinformation about Russia, but in order to explain the Zinoviev Letter we need to first discuss the political climate in Russia at that time. It was 1924, the Civil War was over, it was 2 years since Poland had made Russia mad, which at first led to the forcible spread of communism, but nonetheless instead the Soviets were misled and fled out of threat, and not a year later Lenin was dead. Trotsky gets scrutinized, Europe is yet to be revolutionized, and unutilised goes to communist rhetoric outside of Russia. At that time, Grigory Yevseyevich Zinoviev had become the leader of the Communist International, or the Comintern, and as such sought to conduct international diplomacy with other possibly socialist countries. After the miracle at the Vistula and the failed revolution in Bayern 4 years earlier, other European prospects had died down and Zinoviev started negotiating with the UK. At the same time, the politics within the Communist Party were unstable, and Zinoviev was in a troika or triumvirate with Kamenev and Stalin to get rid of Trotsky. This process was well underway when this letter appeared. It was addressed to the Communist Party in Britain, urging them to take action and infiltrate society to prepare for the revolution, and with the assumption that the normalization of the relations by labor would lead to the radicalization of the nation and the proletariat. 2 days after the publication of the letter, Zinoviev denounced it, saying that it was a forgery from the first word to the last, and that it used the wrong title for the committee, and that it was not the Executive Committee of the Third Communist International, but was the Executive Committee of the Communist International. And at the same time his position was named incorrectly, and he also said that the forger has shown himself to be very stupid in his choice of date. On the 15th of September 1924 I was taking a holiday in Kislovodsk, and therefore could not have signed any official letter. And if we take a closer look at the letter itself, we can also see why it was so damaging within the UK. One particular passage read that a settlement of relations between the two countries will assist in the revolutionization of the international and British proletariat, not less than a successful rising in any of the working districts of England, as the establishment of close contact between the British and Russian proletariat, the exchange of delegations and workers, etc., will make it possible for us to extend and develop the propaganda of ideas of Leninism in England and the colonies. It goes on to talk about that armed warfare must be preceded by propaganda efforts, and that in England it will be much more difficult than the colonies or in Ireland, but you can already see that in this case it kind of robs England of its own agency, and it's seen as an insult to British politics. To explain this further, we also need to discuss what British politics at that time was.
The British Labour Party took office in January 1924, when the new and yet unrecognized Soviet Union had major economic concerns and was largely dependent on trade with Germany. However, the pressure on Germany after World War I and the Treaty of Versailles were considerable risks for the Soviet economy. Hence, the Soviet government started to look for alternative sources of financial support or trade partnership. The Labour Party was an option because of their positions about socialism, evolution and progress. At the same time, the power of the Labour Party in the UK and its growing popularity among European governments could weaken the Soviet Union's position as the champion of proletarian masses. After the de jure recognition of the Soviet government, the new British government would hold a conference to discuss British-Soviet relations. But shortly after the start of the negotiations, they felt they had several topics which were particularly complicated to discuss. On August 5 of 1924, the negotiations were reported to be broken. The Labour government failed to normalize the relations with the Soviet Union, but tried to keep the failure secret. Eventually, the defeat of the British government became inevitable and new general elections were called. 4 days before the elections, the Daily Mail published the Zinoviev Letter.
The Zinoviev Letter can be considered an example of the use of disinformation by a Western organization to interfere with the elections in Britain by delegitimizing the Labour Party, linking them to Zinoviev and his faction within the Communist Party. Published in the Daily Mail, the origin of the letter is unclear, but it can possibly be attributed to sources within the British government, making it a case of disinformation on the part of a Western group or organization. The author of the letter can also possibly be inferred to be members of the Communist Party in Russia, as it argues that the British government should ratify a treaty between Britain and the Soviet Union. Because of the different goals expressed in the Zinoviev letter, it's unclear who wrote it. It can clearly be identified as disinformation because of an intent to interfere in the British elections by accusing the Labour Party of being controlled by the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. By claiming to address the Labour Party on behalf of Zinoviev, the letter represents a conscious effort to mislead British voters and convince them of false information, namely that the Labour Party was connected to Zinoviev's faction of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. The Zinoviev letter obstructed the 1924 elections by spreading this false information in a widely read publication, considerably affecting the perception of the Labour Party within British society. This type of disinformation aimed to undermine confidence in the Labour Party and indirectly sway the election results in the Conservative Party's favour. All things considered, the Zinoviev letter is an important example of disinformation in the early 20th century. It represents a political attempt to undermine the British elections by purposefully spreading false information during a time of political unrest for both Russia and Britain.